Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process and for authors to learn valuable tips on producing and marketing your audiobooks. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk about podcasting, and we're going to focus on step number 1, which in my book is identifying what your gift is and spinning off from that who your podcast will serve and what you're bringing to the world through having your podcast. Because I think that this is really the starting block, the foundation on which everything else is built. So it is likely that if you're considering doing a podcast, you already have some idea about what this podcast will be like. And you probably have some idea or at least energy enthusiasm around what it's going to be. Let's dive down a couple rabbit holes here and start off with the question for yourself of what is your gift? What is it that you want to focus on and bring forth through your podcast? Do you have industry-specific information that you'd like to share? Do you have a great expertise in interviewing people and in helping draw out their gifts within a specific realm? Are you someone who loves to do research and share the things that you have learned and to analyze those things that you've learned as you're sharing them? Are you just really entertaining? And you want to be able to bring smiles to people's faces and to maybe it's a comedy show that you have in mind. You know, is it something that is about entertainment? Or maybe you love to create really scary stories and your podcast is designed to serve that audience of people who love to have a kind of a creepy scare. Maybe it's a thriller or a horror kind of podcast where you're creating scenes or, you know, whether it's written material or just radio drama kind of thing. What is it that gets you excited and that you really want to share? Once you're really clear on that, then the next rabbit hole to step into would be who will your podcast serve? Because really the only reason to do a podcast is for it to be heard by other people. Those other people are only going to take the time out of their lives and commit to listening to the content you're creating if you're creating something of some value to them. This is where it's really critical to understand who your audience is. And we always say, in the audiobook industry, in the book industry, in pretty much any industry where you have something that you want to share with the world, then you really need to understand which segments of the world you're reaching out to. Because if you don't know who you're reaching out to specifically, then what happens is you put out these generalized messages, kind of hoping that someone will be able to find you. And we're so inundated with messaging and we're so overloaded with the amount of content that is available to us that unless it is more directed, we're just not going to find it. Even if as a listener, I may be really interested in your content, if you're not putting it out into the world in a way that is going to bring it to my attention, then I probably won't ever find it. Just because there's so much else out there that is a little more effectively bringing it to my attention. Regardless of what your podcast is going to be about, what kind of information or entertainment you're going to share as a part of your podcast, you need to get clear on what's in it for your audience. So who is your audience is a hand-in-glove kind of connection with what's in it for them. Who are the people who are looking for what you have to offer? And how will they be benefited from listening to your podcast? It's worth spending considerable time on really evaluating these questions, diving into these rabbit holes before you start your podcast for a number of reasons. Even if you're already clear, yes, I'm definitely going to do a podcast. Yes, I have these ideas. If you're not clear on these questions, then you run the risk of either losing your steam, kind of letting the energy diminish from your podcast because you're not on solid footing, or also potentially never reaching your audience. Now let's take that next step into the rabbit hole of your goals. So we talked about your audience and what they need. What is your goal for you? What will creating this podcast do for you? Another way to ask this question is, what's your why? It might be that you have other products or services that you would like to use your podcast to help promote. Could be an audiobook, could be other formats of your book or your whole platform as an author. It could be some kind of coaching you offer or retreats that you run. Maybe you have a lot of insights into financial information and you offer services as a financial planner, for example. If you have both products and services or multiple products and or services, then your podcast will have an increasing overall potential benefit to you. If you're a keynote speaker, for example, and what you hope to gain as a result of developing your podcast is to gain speaking gigs where you're earning tens of thousands of dollars for each presentation, obviously your podcast is going to be a really great investment. So just to wrap up this part of the podcast, and then we're going to take a short pause, is the first thing you want to do is you want to identify your gift and who your gift will serve. What kind of podcast are you going to run in terms of what you're providing for your audience? Then after our pause, we're going to get into the implementation and some questions that you'll want to ask yourself as you move into implementing your podcast. So let's take that pause. We'll be right back.
Are you considering starting your own podcast or already have a podcast that you'd like support with? At Pro Audio Voices, we customize every proposal to ensure you get the support you need. Want social media support to get you launched and rolling with a fast-growing audience? No problem. Need a podcast manager to keep you on track and manage all the post-production and posting of each episode? We've got you. Looking for guidance or a mentor to ensure your growth? At Pro Audio Voices, we're committed to your success. Schedule a call with one of our team to discuss your podcast project today.
Now that we're back, let's talk about implementation. We're clear on what we're doing in terms of what you want to provide. Now, there are many different styles of podcasts, and so the first thing you'll want to do, now that you're clear on your goals and what you're providing, you're going to want to determine your style. When I say style in this particular context, I'm talking about things like, are you going to be doing a solo host where you're just providing tips, for example? You're sharing your knowledge, one person talking into a microphone. Or are you interviewing people? If you're interviewing people, what kinds of people are you interviewing? What will your listeners get from those interviews? Understanding the answer to that question is really helpful so that as you are booking guests and then creating the questions for those guests, knowing your focus and what's in it for your audience will really help you create the questions that you're going to be asking, and thereby creating content that overall is going to be the most beneficial to people. Other types of podcasts, you might be podcasting out a serial version of your audiobook. A podcast like this might not have your voice at all. It might be the professional narrator who recorded your book for you, and it's created and released as a podcast. This type of podcast is a great way to market an audiobook. Even though you're technically giving it away for free, one piece at a time, there are marketing benefits from putting it out there as a podcast. One of those is that you're reaching a different audience many times, because a podcast listener is not necessarily yet an audiobook listener. They are a closely related audience, but they are different. If your podcast is for entertainment, are you doing, again, a solo, or are you doing something where you're entertaining in a different way? Do you have a cast? Maybe it's a scripted podcast. That is also an option. Maybe it's partly scripted with characters from your audiobook, and then you interview guests, or your characters from your book interview guests. They could interview guests who are like real-life guests, or they could interview guests from other audiobooks. In other words, other characters. Fiction, interviewing fiction. Quite fun. Pulling back to the big picture of implementation, if now that you've gotten clear on what style of podcast you want to run, next we want to look at how frequently will you launch podcast episodes. And this is a real important question because you want to provide consistency, and you want your listeners to be able to count on you to release that next episode when you say you're going to do it. Now, life has a lot of stuff that goes on, right? So we want to make sure that the frequency that we're committing to is something that's manageable. That doesn't mean that if you have a weekly podcast that you necessarily need to be able to record weekly, because you don't have to do it live. In other words, I could record several episodes of my podcast and just have them ready and scheduled out so that I can take vacations in case anything comes up that prevents me from recording. But you should give some serious thought to what seems manageable. You can, if initially you feel like, I don't think I can commit to more than once a month, that's okay to start there and increase your frequency rather than decreasing your frequency. It's better to increase than to decrease. So I recommend, if you're not sure, start with where you feel confident you can commit to the frequency, the schedule, and then you'll have the potential to increase that if you choose. There are some other early steps that need to happen when you're getting a podcast set up. And I'm not going to cover all of those in this episode, but I will have other episodes coming up where I'll dive deeper into some of those questions. I will say at this point that some of the things you're going to want to get prepared and will need to prepare are things like your first welcome trailer episode, which is basically where you're going to be letting your listeners know who you are, who this podcast is targeted to, who it's for, who it will help, what those folks will receive as a benefit of listening, so what they're going to gain, what's in it for them, frequency of the podcast, what your plan is for how frequently you'll release episodes, and the call to action to subscribe. Or if you have a different call to action, you could put that in there, but generally the most logical call to action is to subscribe to the podcast. At the start and the setup, you're also going to need to gather your metadata for your podcast, have a cover image that is to spec for the podcast platform or the media hosts, and to get your media host set up so that as you are launching, that you have a place to upload them and a place that will get them out to the podcasting public. Once your podcast is all figured out, set up, and ready to go, then you're really looking at ongoing production and distribution and making sure that you have an appropriate team to work with you, to support you in that process. I will say from experience, it is really helpful to have someone else editing the podcast, someone else managing the podcast, making sure that I'm staying on track on my own schedule and that everyone else is providing what they need to do. It's helpful to have someone else prepare the episode cover image. So all of these are possible, as well as having someone in place to help market. Now, you can do all of these things yourself. And if that appeals to you, great. If it doesn't, select the things that you would rather delegate to somebody else and work with a team. So I'm going to wrap this one up for today. We'll have future episodes that will talk more about podcasts. But I encourage you, if you are considering starting a podcast and are looking for a team and some guidance, to schedule a call with us to discuss your plan in your podcast. Go to proaudiovoices.com, hit the Get Started, and you can schedule a call to talk with me or one of our team members. All right. I hope that this has been valuable for you. If you have questions, I'd love to hear what they are. You can email me at ac@proaudiovoices.com. That's AC for Audiobook Connection at proaudiovoices.com. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to speaking with you if you are someone who's got a podcast idea and ready to get started. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.